Hi class, welcome to your fourth video this week, and this is the last video. I'm in a different venue, as you can see, but the last time we talked about how these New Testament writings started, how they were written, when they were written, and how once those letters from Paul in particular started to circulate, they started being collected in collections, so that, Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, and Paul's letters started circulating together instead of separately. But then there's this other transition from once those letters and books started being collected in a larger volume and circulated like that. What happens from the transition from collecting to these things becoming a canon, a list of authoritative scriptures that were useful and used within the different Christian communities all over the place. So that transition from collection to canon to Holy Scripture is what this lecture is going to be about. Now, this happened over a series of centuries. The first collections started in the first century for sure with Paul's letters. But they started growing in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries when they really, early Christian leaders got into serious debates about what was Scripture and what was not Scripture. What was the New Testament and what was not the New Testament. Now, I know that this video is going to have all the stuff that I wrote on the board backwards. I don't know how to fix that. If any of you are videographers and can help me figure that out, let me know. I use a Mac to make these videos. I'm wide open suggestions. The good thing is every column you hear, this is Marcion, this is the Muratorian canon, this is Eusebius, and this is Athanasius. I took pictures of these and I've uploaded them on our website. So I'm still going to use the backboard to kind of point out some of the main points for each of these columns. But you will also have this as a picture on our e-learning site or our Moodle site or our course website. So you can go there, and I have pictures of each one of these columns so that you can see each bullet point in a way that actually makes sense instead of this photo negative. I don't know how to do that. I'm sorry. In any case, these things started being collected, and the question was, what was Scripture? And who got to make that decision? How do we know something is Holy Scripture or not Holy Scripture once New Testament leaders or leaders of this early Jesus movement started writing? What made something sacred and Holy Scripture and what made something not? Now, you can see over here, if you can read backwards, again, consult the photograph. One of the first real Christian leaders to start collecting books and saying these are authoritative scriptures was this guy named Marcion. Now, the problem that we have about Marcion is that he becomes known as a heretic. So, as Christianity grew, he is certainly not somebody that was part of proto-Christianity or the type of Christianity that became dominant throughout the world. This guy isn't part of that. He's kicked out, considered heretic, heterodox, not a bastion of orthodoxy. So that's the problem with Marcion. But he's the one that started collecting books and saying these are Holy Scriptures. And he first started with Paul's letters. He looked at Paul's letters as Scripture. And he may have been the first person to do that in his own writings and say that out loud. So he collected Paul's letters. He felt like Paul's gospel, although Paul didn't write a gospel, Paul talks about the gospel. And so he says Paul's gospel is the true gospel. And he found in the Gospel of Luke what he felt was Paul's gospel. Now, the thing that made him not orthodox or heterodox was the fact that he rejected the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament. He rejected the Creator, so he thought that was one God, and that the God of this early Jesus movement was a different God. And so that God that Marcion believed in, he felt was revealed in Paul's gospel, in Paul's letters. And he used the Gospel of Luke as one of his Gospels, as his Gospel. So but he didn't just take the Gospel of Luke as we have it. He got the Gospel of Luke and took out the birth narrative, chapter 1 and 2, totally took it out, and then edited the Gospel of Luke. And where it said things about the Hebrew Bible or Judaism, he cut those out. So Marcion was the first one to say, this is the Gospel of Luke, but as an edited version. And then he used certain letters of Paul. And he said, this is the New Testament. These are Holy Scriptures. So he was the first one to really do that. And when he did it, those who disagreed with him and felt like he was wrong, then they started saying, well, these are Holy Scriptures. And so you had this kind of battle in the early Jesus movement between what was Scripture and what was not Scripture. And Marcion was the first to say, these are Scriptures. So, and that's early 2nd century. By the end of the 2nd century, we have this ancient document called the Muratorian canon, and it's actually just a fragment of a manuscript that most likely starts mid-sentence. It starts mid-sentence and most likely refers to Matthew and Mark in what's missing, but where we get it, he's talking about the Gospel of Luke, and it ends kind of with the same kind of fragmentary nature. So that's a problem we have there. But here, the Muratorian canon has all the books of the New Testament that we have. And this is late 2nd century, so this is good news for us, right? Except it does not have the letter to the Hebrews. It does not have the letter of James. It doesn't have 1st and 2nd Peter, and it doesn't have 3rd John. So it has the books that we have, but it does not have those. And then it actually has 2 additional books that we don't have in our New Testament, the Wisdom of Solomon and the Apocalypse of Peter. So according to this list of books and this early writer of the late 2nd century, he feels like the Wisdom of Solomon and the Apocalypse of Peter are both Holy Scripture. Now, the Apocalypse of Peter and the Wisdom of Solomon aren't in the New Testament that we have, but it's certainly important to this early writer. Okay? Now, I don't mean to skip an entire century, and this is happening in real time. And the problem is, so I'm going from 2nd century to 4th century. So the 3rd century is important. For 100 more years, there's debate among early Christian leaders about what books are Scripture and what books aren't Scripture. Now, most of them are accepting the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament as Holy Scripture. But these guys are arguing about what constitutes Scripture for this New Testament. And here Eusebius, he writes his ecclesiastical history, which is also called church history, in about 312. Okay, so that's fairly early 4th century, in 312 of Common Era. And in that 3rd book of the ecclesiastical history, 3rd book, chapter 25, he starts writing about, he has 3 categories: recognized books, and when he says recognized, he's saying these are the ones that everybody recognizes as Holy Scripture of the New Testament. And then he has 2 other categories. Disputed book. These are disputed, so they're not definitely out, but they're not definitely in. We're still arguing about them. And then he has this last category of not genuine. These books are just not genuine. So what does he have? In the recognized books, Eusebius has 22 books. Now, the picture that you have on your website from Eusebius says 21, but I had to make a correction. It's actually 22 because for Eusebius, they understand that the letter of Hebrews was written by Paul. Now, that doesn't mean that it is. It's just that Eusebius believes that and includes the letter of Hebrews in Paul's letters. Okay? So that ends up being 22 books of the New Testament, which is our 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Acts, and then Paul's letters. Now, he doesn't specifically give us every letter that Paul wrote. He just said Paul's letters. So that's somewhat problematic because we think Hebrews is mentioned in that. Then he says 1 John, 1 Peter, and Revelation. That is the undisputed books by 312. Now, there's this caveat with the book of Revelation. He says it's part of the recognized books if it seems desirable. So Revelation is, we don't know where to put Revelation even in 312. They're still arguing about it. Eusebius puts it as recognized, but he also puts it down as not genuine too. So the disputed books, there's 5 disputed books that he mentions: James, Jude, 2nd and 3rd John, and 2nd Peter. So at 312, those books that we absolutely can have in our New Testament right now are still debating. They're still debating whether these books are sacred scripture or not. So they're disputed books. And then Eusebius gives 5, maybe 6 not genuine books that he doesn't believe should be in the New Testament: Acts of Paul, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Apocalypse of Peter. Now, the Apocalypse of Peter, according to the Muratorian canon, is definitely scripture. By the time Eusebius writes, he says it's definitely not genuine, so it shouldn't be counted in the New Testament. The Epistle of Barnabas, the teaching of the apostles, and the Revelation. So according to Eusebius, in 312 of the Common Era, the Revelation is either a recognized book or it's not genuine at all. So it kind of begs the question, what is the issue around the Revelation? Now, the other one is he talks about the Gospel of Hebrews, and some people believe that the Gospel of Hebrews is important in Scripture and others don't. And that is not the letter to the Hebrews. It's a whole other book, the Gospel of Hebrews. So you can see through these different ages, early 2nd century, late 2nd century, early 3rd century, that there's a lot of debate about what constitutes the New Testament, what collection of, what list of these books are Holy Scripture. And finally we get to Athanasius. Athanasius was the bishop of Alexandria, Egypt. He's an incredibly important figure in early Christianity, specifically in the 4th century. At the Council of Nicaea in 325, he's the one who led the charge, and he actually was considered victorious in that council. Because of his victory, another bishop of Alexandria, a deacon at the time, Arius, was condemned as a heretic, and they were called Arians and kicked out. But Athanasius won that battle. It's in his Easter sermon from Alexandria, Egypt, in the year 367 that we get our first list in history that we know of. In 367, we get our first list of the 27 books that we have in our New Testament, with no additional books and no fewer books. So this is the first time in recorded history that we get the list of 27 books that we have right now, with no more and no less. Now, there are lists that come later that also include the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas. Those 2 books are very important in early Christianity, and they don't really get kicked out or not used until much later. Even Codex Sinaiticus, this the first complete New Testament or Bible that we have in Greek, which is written centuries later, it actually includes the Shepherd of Hermas and the Epistle of Barnabas in it. So those 2 continue to be very, very important, but eventually don't make those 27. So the question is, what constitutes the criteria by which a book was included in the New Testament? And this is a theological question. It can be a theological question because a lot of Protestants would argue that the letters of the New Testament were inspired by God, and that early Christian leaders only recognized that inspiration, and that's how they determined whether it was canon or not. Other people believe that those early church leaders were a part of the movement, a part of the inspiration, and they were the ones that determined which ones were in and which ones were out. There's a much more Catholic concept of or a kind of a theology of Scripture or the doctrine of Scripture. Or you can say both of those were the case. But as we read early Christian documents or early Jesus-following documents, we do see that there tend to be about three criteria that determine whether a book was considered Holy Scripture in the New Testament or not. The first criteria was antiquity, or is it ancient, is it old? And some of the arguments around the Shepherd of Hermas in particular revolve around this. So a lot of people said that the Shepherd of Hermas isn't early, therefore it shouldn't be a part of the New Testament. So antiquity, the antiquity of a document is important to whether it was accepted into the New Testament or not. That's one part of the criteria. The second part, equally important, is the apostolic authority. Was this letter written by an apostle, or was it written by a student of an apostle? And this is why people question the letter to the Hebrews. There are people who believe, there are early Christians that believe that Paul wrote to Hebrews, therefore it absolutely should be included. And so Paul's authorship of Hebrews was what makes Hebrews in our part of the New Testament. And other Christian leaders argued against that because it doesn't say it's written by Paul. And because of that, others say, no, we don't know that this is written by Paul, therefore we cannot accept it. This is why it's in that kind of disputed book territory, according to Eusebius. So Hebrews makes it into the New Testament because eventually early believers, early leaders said that it was written by Paul, therefore it's included. So Hebrews is is a test case about this apostolic authority. Now Luke, the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Mark are also, although they're written by Mark and Luke supposedly, Mark and Luke are also tied really close to Paul and Peter. Therefore, the apostolic authority from Paul and Peter give Luke and Mark that kind of apostolic authority as well. So antiquity, apostolic authority, and finally kind of acceptedness or usefulness within the congregations of early Christianity. That was the other criteria. Were these texts actually useful for congregations? Were they useful in instruction? Were they useful in worship? And those that were included in the New Testament. And that, so not useful and accepted, but useful in doctrine. Were these books helpful in congregations understanding God better? And so do these texts coincide with the rule of faith? In other words, did these letters bolster the faith that these early proto-Christians did it bolster that faith that they had? And this is where the revelation becomes a big question, because the revelation is so kind of end times that a lot of these early Christians didn't know where to fit that in their belief system. So Revelation became a very contentious book based on its usefulness in church life, both in doctrine and in worship. So it took 4 centuries or 5 centuries to come to a New Testament. And this is a real short, although it's the longest video you've had so far, this is a real short synopsis of how these collections of writings, these collection of letters and gospels ended up becoming the New Testament that we have today over a period of centuries. That's it for this week. I hope you've enjoyed the lectures. I look forward to next week meeting with you again. Any questions that you might have, feel free to send me an email. Thanks.